There is a version of you that gets things done. That version knows how to walk into a room, knows what to say and what not to say, knows how to hold the face steady when something inside is quietly falling apart. You've been building that version for a long time. Maybe you don't even notice it anymore. How automatically it assembles itself in the morning, how it adjusts to whoever's watching, how it performs calm when you're not calm, performs certainty when you're not certain, performs fine when nothing feels fine. Have you ever caught yourself explaining yourself to someone? Not because they asked, but because you felt their silence as a kind of judgment? Have you ever been complimented for your composure and felt something strange underneath that? Not pride, something quieter, something that knew the compliment wasn't entirely reaching you. Or maybe this. Someone close to you asks how you're really doing, and the answer that comes out, practiced, managed, reasonable, isn't quite the answer you were living. There's nothing obviously wrong with any of this. Managing how you appear is something everyone does. It's functional, it's social, it works, except sometimes it doesn't feel like it's working. Sometimes the very thing that holds you together in front of others is the thing that makes you feel most alone when they're gone. Consider someone. We'll call them the manager. They'd spent years building a reputation at work. Reliable, level-headed, the person who had answers, or at least always appeared to. At home, it was quieter. A partner, a small apartment, a life that from the outside seemed settled, but something had been accumulating. It wasn't one event. It was smaller than that, a series of moments where they caught themselves performing, reassuring a colleague with words they didn't believe, laughing off a comment from a family member that had actually landed, telling their partner I'm okay, not because it was true, but because it was easier, because saying anything else would require an explanation they hadn't found the language for yet. The manager began waking up earlier than necessary. Not to work, just to sit. They couldn't have named what they were doing in those early mornings. Waiting, maybe. Or just being themselves before the day required them to be something else. One afternoon, a junior colleague made a small mistake, the kind the manager had made 100 times before, and something shifted. The response that came out was harsher than intended. Tight. Over-controlled. The colleague looked down, said nothing. The manager walked back to their office and sat very still. Not because of the colleague. Not exactly. Something else was in the room with them. Something they hadn't quite looked at directly. Here's what's easy to believe. That control is strength. That keeping yourself together, presenting the managed, composed, capable version is evidence of something. Emotional maturity, perhaps. Or simply professionalism. Or just what adults do. But there's a question underneath that. What if the composure is serving something other than strength? What if the performance of stability is actually the management of fear? Not a dramatic fear, a quiet one. The fear that if the composed version cracks, even slightly, if someone sees the uncertainty beneath the confidence, the exhaustion beneath the reliability, something will be lost. Their respect, their trust, you're standing in their eyes. And here's what makes it subtle. The fear doesn't announce itself. It feels like standards. It feels like discipline. It feels like being the kind of person who doesn't burden others. That is the distortion, not in the composure itself, but in what it has quietly become. This is where the mind starts to do something not entirely honest. It starts to confuse the mask with the face. Carl Jung called this mask the persona. Not as an insult. He meant it as a description, a word borrowed from the Latin for the masks worn in ancient theater. Something you put on to play a role, to be legible to others, to navigate social life. The persona is the professional self, the capable parent, the friend who always has perspective, the person who doesn't need much. It is not bad, it is necessary. Everyone has one, everyone needs one. But Jung noticed something that most people resist. The longer you wear a persona without ever turning toward what's behind it, the more the mask and the self begin to blur together. Not all at once. Slowly, almost imperceptibly. You stop knowing where one ends and the other begins. And that is not strength. That is a different kind of loss. Quieter than most losses, and harder to name. Jung made a claim that is worth sitting with slowly. He said that the persona, the polished, presentable self, develops partly as a way of avoiding the shadow. The shadow isn't evil, not in the dramatic sense. It's simply what we don't want to acknowledge about ourselves. The parts deemed unacceptable, the weakness, The neediness, the anger, the doubt. The parts that were discouraged early and then quietly buried. We don't bury these things on purpose. It happens gradually, socially, over years of learning what gets rewarded and what doesn't. The child who cried too much. The adolescent who wanted too much and was told to be realistic. The adult who needed something and learned, after enough experiences, not to show it. And here's what Jung observed. What we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves doesn't disappear. It goes somewhere else. It operates from below the surface. It shows up sideways, in overreactions that confuse even us. In the tightening around the chest when someone appears too comfortable with imperfection. In the irritation we feel toward people who seem to need too much, or ask for too much, or show too much. In the harshness that surfaces unexpectedly toward the person who reminds us of something we've long suppressed. Here is the uncomfortable part. The more tightly you hold the persona together, the more pressure builds in what it's holding back. The composure and the shadow are not separate. They are in direct relationship. One grows as the other is denied. So consider this, the composure you've cultivated, the reputation you've maintained, the version of yourself that never quite lets the seams show. What if part of its function is to keep the shadow quiet? Not to resolve it, not to understand it, just to keep it from being seen. And if that's true, then the exhaustion isn't really about the effort the days require. It's about the effort of not being fully yourself. There's a question Jung leaves in the room without answering. Who are you when the performance isn't required? Not as a liberating question, as a disorienting one. Because most people, if they're honest, find that it's harder to answer than it should be. The performance has been running so long, and so automatically, that its absence doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like nothing. And that hollow space where a self should be, is what the persona was quietly preventing you from noticing. Let's return to the manager in that office, sitting still. What was in the room with them? What was the thing they hadn't quite faced? It wasn't guilt about the colleague, not entirely. It was something more structural. The recognition, arriving without announcement, that the harshness had come from somewhere they hadn't chosen, that the reaction had not been a controlled one at all, that the very thing they had built their identity on, composure, reliability, the appearance of being in command, had for a moment completely failed them. And what that moment revealed was not a character flaw. It was the shadow making contact. Jung was specific about this. The parts of ourselves we refuse to integrate don't weaken over time. They accumulate. They wait. And when they surface, they often surface at the expense of whoever happens to be nearby, not because that person deserves it, but because they were standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment, carrying the wrong resemblance to something we haven't resolved. The manager's harshness wasn't really about the colleague's mistake. It was about the long-suppressed admission that they, too, make mistakes. That they feel lost. That they need things they haven't asked for. That they have been performing certainty in front of others for so long that the performance had quietly become a prison, one they built themselves, brick by brick, and had come to mistake for solid ground. This is the hidden motivation behind the need to appear perfect. It is not pride exactly. This is older than pride. It is the fear that if the real self is revealed uncertain, imperfect, sometimes confused, sometimes needing, there will be no one on the other side of that revelation who still finds you worth knowing. And that fear is old. Far older than the job, far older than the reputation, far older than the composure itself. It reaches back to some early moment, different for everyone, when being the unfinished, uncertain version of yourself cost something, when it was met with disappointment, or impatience, or silence. When the message arrived, not in words, that the acceptable version was the capable one, and so you made yourself capable, and kept making yourself more capable, and called it growth, and it was. But it was also in some part flight. Here's where things become less comfortable. The question of whether you're being too hard on yourself, or not managing things well enough, or struggling with perfectionism. Those are ways of framing the problem as behavioral, as something you could fix if you just found the right approach. If you were a little more self-compassionate, a little more willing to delegate, a little better at setting expectations. But Jung wasn't offering a behavioral fix. He was suggesting something more foundational, that the issue isn't what you do, it's what you believe yourself to be. If the persona has become the self, if the composed, reliable, always together version is genuinely who you think you are, then every crack in that surface isn't just an inconvenience, it's a threat to identity. That's why the reaction is always too large for the event, a small mistake that gets oversized shame attached to it. A piece of criticism that lands with far more weight than the critic intended, a moment of being seen as uncertain, or confused, or simply human, and the disproportionate urgency to correct it, explain it, cover it. That's why being seen as uncertain, or wrong, or anything other than completely capable doesn't just feel uncomfortable. It can feel like erasure. Because in some real sense it is. If who you are is the mask, then removing the mask doesn't reveal you. It removes you, and this is the thing most approaches to self-improvement quietly avoid. The problem isn't the behavior is the symptom. The root is a self-concept that cannot afford to be human, that has staked its entire sense of value on the version of itself that doesn't need anything, doesn't struggle with anything, and never lets the seams show. That is a very narrow place to live, and it gets narrower, because the world keeps producing situations that require you to be uncertain, to not know, to be visibly unfinished. And each time that happens, the gap between who you believe yourself to be and who you actually are grows slightly wider, until that gap becomes the source of the exhaustion, not the days, the distance. Jung believed that the goal wasn't to dismantle the persona. You need it. The world requires it. The persona isn't the enemy. The goal was integration. To know what you're wearing. To stop confusing the mask with the face beneath it. To allow both to exist, the composed professional self and the uncertain, unfinished human beneath it, without the performance of the one erasing the reality of the other. This is harder than it sounds, because integration requires something the persona was specifically built to prevent: the willingness to be seen as unfinished, not as performance, not as vulnerability deployed strategically in a way that still controls what the other person sees, but as simple, private acknowledgement to yourself, first, before anyone else, that the uncertainty is real, the exhaustion is real, the moments of not knowing are real. The cracks are not failures of character, they are the character. The fullness of a person includes the parts they've been carefully hiding. And what Jung noticed, and what's worth sitting with, is that people who have allowed themselves to become acquainted with their shadow tend to be less threatened by imperfection in others, less likely to react with harshness toward the person who shows what they themselves refuse to show, less likely to project onto others the qualities they can't accept in themselves. There is something quieter in them, a kind of ease that isn't performed, not because they've resolved everything, but because they've stopped pretending there's nothing left to resolve. That quietness isn't weakness. It's the result of no longer spending energy on the management of the gap. There is no instruction here, no practice to begin, no reframe to adopt. This isn't something to do next Tuesday, it's a noticing. A slow noticing over time of what the performance is costing, of where the exhaustion is actually coming from, of what happens in a quiet moment when the version of yourself that gets things done takes a breath, and something else, something older, something truer, briefly surfaces. You don't have to do anything with that. Not yet. Just notice that it's there. Stop pretending to be perfect, the title says. But Jung would probably push on that gently. It's not about trying to be imperfect. It's about recognizing that the self you've been protecting so carefully, the one that cannot be wrong, cannot be weak, cannot be seen in the middle of something unresolved, is not actually you. It is the door you built in front of yourself, somewhere underneath the composure, underneath the reputation and the management and the long-practiced responses. There is a person who is more complete than the version they've been presenting. Not better, not more admirable, just more true. That person doesn't need to announce themselves. They don't need to perform their authenticity any more than they've been performing their certainty. They just need to be acknowledged, privately, first, with patience. Jung spent a lifetime suggesting that the examined life isn't comfortable, but it's the only one that's actually yours. Maybe that's enough to sit with for now.